The next question is, how does neuroscience intertwine with inclusivity? And since we know neuroscience, as we've talked so much about neuroscience, I just want to know how this concept actually intertwines with inclusivity, in your opinion.
Well, so the general framework of neurodiversity, I think, has done a lot to really change and to provide really an empirical understanding of how that really has demolished, I think, some of the structures of exclusivity that were posited in a pre-neuroscience era, right? So, for example, I mean, looking at just behavioral data, 100 years ago, people would have said men are smarter than women, right? And this would have been scientific fact at the time, right? Because you have two groups of people who are very differently socialized. You have no understanding at that time of how socialization influences the brain. And so you take people as they are, you make biologically essentialist assumptions, untested and therefore unscientific assumptions. But you rigorously even test men and women as groups, and then you conclude that men are smarter than women, right? That's what you would do 100 years ago with these two groups of people who were so differently socialized. And of course, a lot of what's changed is social movements that have changed the ways in which men and women are socialized and the degree of equality to access in education that men and women, to the extent that these are equal across, right now using these very binary categories. There's still a lot that remains. There are gaps in in STEM between again just these very binary categories of men and women, and these continue to be examples of what are sort of just put across as uncontestable fact, right? And yet we forget what was an uncontestable fact 100 years ago changes, that the fact itself changes as social movements change the ways in which people are socialized. And now we have a strong understanding of how socialization affects the brain, that we have a mechanism, right? We have a clear and plausible and understandable mechanism. It's not feminist wishing that socialization influences the brain, right? We now have mechanisms that demonstrate this. We also now have a lot of examples of an understanding of how sometimes brain lesions can enhance abilities of in some cases of certain kinds that people show, and understanding therefore that different brains, even different versions of the same person's brain, may produce very different human beings. That there isn't one thing that you would call an ability or an intelligence. So I think in some ways neuroscience has changed, and also there are multiple ways in which neural systems can sometimes produce similar behavioral outcomes. And so I think a lot of these have chipped away at the idea that there is one thing, that there is such a thing as sort of singularly defined intelligence, that there is one way to things, that there is one optimal way for brains to do things, and so on and so forth. At least with respect to several particular tasks. And the framework of neurodiversity, I think, also helps because we now understand, we don't just sort of take these biologically essentialist assumptions that sort of your brain is this given thing that you have and that it's entirely dependent on genes as sort of one group, but we also understand that different genes actually, produce very, very different, each gene is responsible for essentially the action of particular sets of, splicing particular sets of proteins, right? And that each of those play particular roles in both neural development and neural functioning, and may also play different roles at different times, such that their influence on behavior is not simplistic. And with that understanding, we also know then that all of us are variants from each other, right? All of us are mutants. And that, I think, also chips away at a lot of the very pathological sort of understanding of behavior that defined kind of historical psychological approaches, where there was one thing that was seen as a norm and then things were seen as deviant, and instead we now understand that we're all sort of just we're all mutants with respect to all of our genes, right? We're all, even if you were to, for a given gene, define a wild type as in a very majoritarian sort of sense of what it even means to have, this may not even be an ancestral gene, it may actually be a mutant away from an ancestral form. So you can have ways to think of genes in ways that sort of hold some up as being majoritarian or hold some up as being ancestral. But we really do know that that certainly, when you consider all of our genes together, that we are all mutants relative to one another, right? On one axis or another. And so I think that really also changes the ways in which people are understood as mutant, aberrant, different, deviant, away from an assumption that most people are some norm, right? And some undesirables are out in the periphery. So I think that there are a lot of our, just deepening our understanding of the brain and of genes and of the ways in which socialization influences behavior. Although really, and neuroscientists have known that socialization influences behavior for many, many years now. Although somehow that understanding hasn't really percolated, I think, outside neuroscience to a greater social understanding of what biologists are saying overall. But I really think that there's immense potential in what neuroscience can do and has done for chipping away at some of these notions of exclusivity. Right? I wouldn't say neuroscience is inclusive per se, it's not. But some of what we found has chipped away at structures of exclusivity, and a lot of structures of exclusivity continue to remain, both in society and in science itself, and in the composition of who does science, and therefore in the kinds. You could ask the question of why it took so long for some of these questions to be asked. Right, some of these very obvious questions, and the answer is that the people who were science were all, rich white men, largely, numerically speaking, and that they just didn't have a reason to, answer some of these questions.